All right. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to TDX. We are almost at the end of day one. Looking forward to the concert. Looking forward to the session. Okay, perfect. So welcome to today's session where we're going to talk about Salesforce APIs. And before we get started, please base all your purchasing decisions based on generally available information and not based on anything I might share today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Aditya and I am a developer advocate here at Salesforce. And in my job, I ensure all of you, that is developers, admins, architects, are successful on using the Salesforce platform. And we do that by creating videos, blog posts, webinars, hands-on workshops, and all that stuff. So you can reach out to me on LinkedIn in case you're looking for something, and any updates we have that go on LinkedIn as well. So today we are going to be talking about Salesforce APIs, and this is an intro level session. So we are going to basically introduce you to the different APIs that we have and give you a little bit of guidance on when you can use what. And then we are going to talk about authentication and authorization, which actually goes hand in hand with the APIs, because without one, the other doesn't exist. And we'll give you a glimpse about how you can use these APIs inside Agentforce. So that's going to be today's agenda. So let's get started. All of you would have seen this slide in the keynote today. We have launched Salesforce Headless 360, essentially, which means anything headless. What it means is that you don't need to have a UI to access that. You can access a platform or a feature without a UI. And APIs is one of the oldest ways in which you could do that. These days, it is more about MCPs and stuff, but APIs has always been there, and it's going to continue being there as well. And the thing with Salesforce is that this was an easy step for us, because for the past 27 years, we've always built features in an API-first manner. Like any feature that you have in Salesforce, almost always has a corresponding API. So you don't always have to rely on the UI of Salesforce to get things done. And every single feature that you're seeing on the slide has some or the other API that backs it up. Now, those APIs can be grouped at a glance. This is how I group it, where at first you have the data APIs. So whether it is any feature in Salesforce, whether it is like Data 360, Agentforce, Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, everything is backed by data. And this data you can access out of the Salesforce platform using these data APIs. We have two major variations. One is REST and the other one is SOAP. REST is JSON based. SOAP is XML based for legacy systems probably, but REST is what majority of the use cases support. And then we have bulk API. So this is a Salesforce variation of one of the REST APIs that we have. Because when you use REST and SOAP APIs, you typically work with either one record or a limited set of records. But what if you want to deal with millions of records, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000? What if you want to load them or read them? That is where bulk API comes into picture. It's an API that specializes in handling bulk data. So what is the difference? Let's take a simple REST API. You make a request to get some information. You get the information back immediately. In the case of bulk API, it is a little bit asynchronous because the volume of the data is different. So you make a request. You get a request ID back. In the background, we do all the processing. Once that is ready, you can use the same ID to get the data. So that's how these two primarily differ. And then you have UI API. Whatever you're seeing on Lighting Experience, you're seeing data. But you're also seeing data in a specific format. Like what is the layout? Which field is being shown? What is the label of that field? If a different language user is looking at it, what is the label that is being shown? So all of that information is also going to be returned with the UI API. REST APIs is just data. UI API is data along with the layout in which it has to be positioned. Then you have Apex REST. Now this is important because all the APIs that we offer are kind of standard APIs. You don't get to change how the API works. But with Apex REST, you can create any Apex class that does any functionality that you want. I mean, with Apex, you can do whatever you want. All that business logic can be exposed via an API endpoint. And that is what Apex REST is all about. And finally, we have GraphQL API, which is an industry standard way of getting data out. So it's been introduced by Facebook quite some time ago. It's a different query language altogether. It's just that we support that as well. Now, all of these data APIs work in a request response kind of a format. So if you want something, you ask for it and you get it back. But the other flavor that we have are event-driven APIs, which is what we also call as PubSub, which is publish subscribe, which means you don't ask for data, data gets pushed to you. Think of it like push notifications. If somebody like follows you on on Instagram, you get a push notification saying that somebody followed that. You don't ask for it. So that is publish subscribe, where one system publishes an event and any number of systems can listen to that event. So there is no limit on that. So you just publish and whoever wants to listen can listen to it, just like this session. I'm talking, anybody can join in, listen and go away. That's publish subscribe. And then you have tooling APIs. Both these flavors, data APIs and event-driven, we spoke about, is predominantly data. But Salesforce, as you know, is metadata-driven. Everything has a corresponding metadata component. So these metadata is also made available to you using APIs. So if you want to deploy an Apex class, retrieve an Apex class, agents, so anything in Salesforce can be deployed or retrieved using the metadata APIs. And finally, you have feature-specific APIs, which is, like the name suggests, specific to a feature. So you have APIs that deal with data cloud, APIs that deal with sales cloud functionality, maybe forecasting, maybe identity resolution. So different features have different dedicated APIs. So the whole intention of this slide is to tell you that we have a lot of APIs and you can pick and choose based on the one that best suits your needs. Now, while all the others have dedicated use cases like event-driven, you know you'll use it when you want publish subscribe, feature-specific, whenever you want to use a feature. But with data APIs, there are quite a few available, and this decision chart is going to help you figure out when you have to use what. So whenever you want raw data, you just go with REST and SOAP. But if you want this raw data to be shown in a UI somewhere, maybe let's say you want to show it in Slack. Could be a use case. In that case, you would go with a UI API. If you're dealing with more than 1,000 records, you go with bulk API. If not, you settle down with REST API. If you're dealing with metadata, you go with metadata API, or you use the tooling API depending on whether you want synchronous or asynchronous operations. So just take a picture of this slide, and this should be an initial guiding point of how things work. Now, all of these APIs, we have given you an easy way to explore all of them. Like you don't have to go through the documentation, which is quite huge. We have created a Postman collection, and Postman is a tool that lets you try out APIs. So you don't just read it theoretically, you get to try it out. And this is that Postman collection. You can just Google for it. It's as simple as that. Just search for Salesforce Developers API Postman collection, and you will get to this link. And you have all the different APIs that we have, like feature specific. Maybe you want to start talking to Agentforce. There is an API for that. You want to talk with Marketing Cloud. There is an API for that. And so on and so forth. Quite a large number of APIs that you have, including Data 360 and Salesforce Platform APIs as well. Now, once you have imported this collection, so there is steps and all which you can read through in the documentation. But essentially, every API, you can call it from Postman and see how it works. So for example, here I'm dealing with a couple of examples that I want to show you. First, we have the S-object create. So it's not just about reading data, by the way. You can create, update, delete, all of that using APIs. So there are dedicated endpoints. Again, none of it that you need to remember. Everything is available, documented for you to try out. So here, all you specify is what is the object that you want to create, and in a JSON format, all the field information. So first name, last name, so on and so forth. And once you click send, you get a response back with the Salesforce ID. So similarly, you can read information. Again, S-object, the name of the object that you want to read, and the record ID that you want to read. And then you get information about that record and all the fields that you have access to. That is a very important statement. Every API also respects your user permissions. So whoever is accessing the API, the information returned is going to be based on that particular user. And then you have your query endpoint. Now here is where we give you a little bit flexibility, where you can write your own SOQL queries You can fire them off using the API and get the relevant results. Now, this is particularly useful for agents because agents can dynamically query for any data that you want based on your request. So they can form a query and then hit this endpoint. But what if you want to restrict them? You don't want to fire all the queries, but give them certain queries that they can access. That is where we have a new feature called named query. So within setup, basically what you do is you create a query and you give it a name. And these are the names that an agent can access, or any other system for that matter. It is not just agents. APIs can be called by any system. So that system can access this query using the name. So the other system doesn't need to know what query you have written. All they need to know is the name of the query endpoint. So the way it works is very simple. It's again a different endpoint, by the way. So all you do is you specify the name of the query, in this case contacts by type. They don't even need to know what query is running behind the scenes. And then in case you have defined any where conditions with dynamic properties in your query, you get to pass that in as well. So here I want to filter based on guest type. So I can send that as a parameter. So that gets automatically embedded into the query. The query runs behind the scenes and gets me the results. So that way you have a little bit more control on how you want to give access to external systems to what queries and stuff like that. And finally, I spoke about Apex REST, which is your Apex classes that can be exposed. And within your Apex class, you can add any functionality that you want. What I have done is actually pretty simple. I have a simple class and I'm just returning a hello world. I mean, it can't get simpler than this. So what I do is, again, there is a different endpoint, but I can invoke that particular Apex class. And if you see the result, it says just hello world. So literally you can return whatever you want, whether it's a string, whether it's a JSON, XML, YAML. In Apex, whatever you want to do, you can. That's what is going to be sent down to the external system. So that is APIs at a glance and how you can explore all of these APIs. And with Agentforce specifically, out of the box, of course, what we support is named queries and Apex REST APIs as agent actions. So I hope you know about agent actions. You can create them from Apex classes, flows, external services, and so on. But now we also support named queries and Apex REST classes. So you create it once, make it an agent action, and then agent can keep using it. Now coming to the other important part of APIs where I told we'll talk about authorization and authentication. Now from Postman, I invoked these APIs, but I had to authorize first in order to access these APIs. I cannot access them just like that. Now there are two important steps for you to access any API in Salesforce. So first is you have to create an external client application. Now if you are familiar with connected apps, this is the next generation of connected apps, and we all recommend you to migrate to this because it's much more secure and it's also deployment friendly. Like you can retrieve external client apps down to your source control, put them into your CI/CD pipelines and all of that stuff. Now what is an external client app essentially is it can identify a particular system. So you have your Salesforce APIs, which can be invoked by any system. But how do you know which system is accessing your APIs? So you have to identify a system, and for that you create an external client app. And the external client app gives you a client ID and a client secret. That is common across the industry, by the way. So a client ID and client secret is the one that you give to any external system. So let's say today I want to integrate to Salesforce from Slack. I need Slack to identify itself using a client ID and client secret. So that's what external clients app is all about. So that is step one. You create a connected app or an external client application, and then you share the client ID and client secret to any app that wants to integrate. Now you identify the app. You can say, okay, the request is coming in from so-and-so application, but who is requesting for the information? So that is the second step. So it's not just the system that requests for it, it's the user that is asking for the data. That is where authorization comes into picture. So as a Salesforce user, you must authorize that external application to access the data on your behalf. So the system can't just say, I want the data. It has to ask the data on behalf of some user, because everything in Salesforce belongs to a user. So For authorization, there are different flows. There are up to 7 flows depending on different requirements, but I've highlighted the key flows over here, which is web server, client credentials, and JWT bearer. People like to call JWT JOT also, but just out there. Why are there 3 different flows? Now think of integrating 2 systems together. You can either do that on behalf of every user. So let's say I'm accessing Salesforce from Slack. I want to retrieve records on my behalf. So every user feels the same. Like if you are asking for data, it should be requesting on your behalf, not on my behalf. So that is what we call per user, where the data is dependent on who is asking for it. But what if you have scenarios like data integrations or backend data syncs, where it doesn't really matter who's requesting for it. It's more of a single integration user that is setting up the end-to-end, and all the integration happens through that one single end-to-end integration user. So that's where we have the client credentials flow, where it is a server-to-server integration with a single integration user. Whereas web server and JWT bearer flows, or let me put it a different way, web server flow is per user. So anytime you want to access APIs on behalf of a particular user, you go with web server flow. If you want a single integration user, you go with client credentials flow. If you want both, you go with a JWT bearer flow. So that's how it is set up. You can again take a picture of this slide because there are quite a few differences over there, where some flows require both a client ID and client secret. The other ones require a certificate, which is much more complex to set up, but also much more secure. And the other one just needs a client ID. So stuff like that. The flows itself are complicated. We cannot do that in an intro session. So we'll have to do a deeper dive for that. Now, once you set up both of these, I actually want to show you a quick demo of how that looks like. So back in setup, here is your external client application. You can name it whatever you want. Essentially, it's a way for you to identify the external system. You can set all of this basic details, and then you get your consumer key and consumer secret over here, which is nothing but your client ID and client secret that you share with the external system. The most important thing that you do with an external client app is also define scopes. A scope controls what an app can do. So you can't just have an app do everything on Salesforce. You can restrict it. You can say you can only access this feature, or you have full access. So that is what you define over here. There are a bunch of different scopes that you have depending on your requirement. You have to be very specific about what access you give a particular external client app. Within the app, you also decide what flows that you want to enable. Whether you want to enable the external, the client credentials flow or the JWT bearer flow, it's up to you to decide. So if you uncheck this box, even though somebody has your client ID and client secret, they won't be able to use JWT to authenticate into the system. They'll only have to use client credentials. So there's a lot of lockdown that you can configure just with your external client application. So once you do this, I have set up a simple Node.js script, which is nothing but JavaScript, by the way. But what I want to show you here is the endpoints. So here I'm using the client credentials flow, where there is no end user in place. I don't need to log in and all. There is one single integration user through which all of this happens. So I hit the OAuth 2 token endpoint, and I just pass in the client ID and client secret. And what I get back is an access token. And that access token I can use to hit any REST API or SOAP API, any API in Salesforce essentially. All I need to do is pass in that token as a bearer token in the header. Again, all of this is documented, but I just want to show you how it really looks like in real life. So once I run this code, this is what it looks like. Like the first response I get from my token endpoint after passing the client ID and client secret is the access token. And a bunch of different details, again, depending on how secure you want to get. External systems typically store this access token, and then you can use the access token to call out to any API, and here I'm getting the user information that is currently logged in. So literally no user intervention. But what about the web server flow? Web server flow is the one that acts on behalf of a particular user. So that is slightly tricky to configure because there are 2 steps involved. Here I'm directly passing my client ID and client secret to the token endpoint because it is generic. But what if it is user specific? Now, if it is user specific, let me run this. So the first step in a web server flow is for the users to log in. Now what you see here is any external system, they need to redirect the users back to Salesforce. So let's say I'm on Google or Slack. If I have to initiate this integration, I'll redirect the users to Salesforce to log in. But I don't just do a simple redirection. I pass in certain parameters. I pass in my client ID to say who is it that is redirecting them to that. And I pass in a redirect URL. So from an external system, I'm sent to Salesforce to log in, but I have to come back to the external system because I don't stay in Salesforce. I have to come back to my system to access the data. So I set that up. And I pass in the scope, which is what all information I want back. And this is the final redirect URL. And the moment you click login to Salesforce, you're actually sent to Salesforce. And since I'm already logged in, it redirects me back. If you notice the URL, it is coming back to my local host. And the reason it doesn't work is typically it is always a HTTPS URL. My local host is HTTP. So if I change that, depending on how I've configured it, it's either going to throw an error because I've already used this code. Now, once I get back, notice that in the URL, it passes a code back to me. So now what I have is my client ID, I have a client secret, and I also have a code from the user. So this is a user specific code. The user has logged in, it sent a code back to my system. So now what I do is I go to the same token URL, but along with the client ID and client secret, I also pass in this code. So then it returns me back the same access token, but this time it is configured to that particular user. So that is the only difference between a web server flow and your client credentials flow. So this is just again a quick sneak peek on how a real life code looks like when you're integrating with Salesforce. Postman and all looks very fancy, but in real life you'll have to write and set up all of this if you're not using stuff like MuleSoft and other point and click tools. So back in our presentation, there are of course limits for APIs. It's not like we give you unlimited API calls. Whenever you're calling a Salesforce endpoint, there are limits on the number of calls that you can make in a 24-hour window. And that you can find in your Salesforce setup, or again, there is another API that gives you the limits. The limits are pretty generous, by the way. Like it's 1 million requests or something that you have for 24 hours. Again, depends on your edition, the number of licenses you have, and so on and so forth. So that's something that you have to consider whenever you're making API callouts. So if you have a system that is polling every 5 seconds, it might hit your limits. So plan your integrations accordingly. And finally, the resources. Again, hopefully this has been a good enough intro to pique interest into the API world, because headless is what all of us are getting into. So if you want to check out more, then please scan the resources, go through the documentation for all the different APIs that we have, and most importantly, the authorization flows. Like I said, you'll have to spend some time looking at the different flows and figuring out the best flow for your own use case. So please do that. And with that, I would like to say thank you. Thank you for joining my session, and hope it's been useful. And see you again.